Hi, welcome back. I'm so glad to be with all of you again today. And we have Andreea Parc with us again, continuing to tell her journey, and it is a profound one. A reminder that she is the author of this book, Alive Again. You can see I've got all my favorite passages marked. Anyway, happy to have Andreea with us today. Hi, Andreea.
Hi, Teresa.
So let's go back into the horrors of MCC. Take the audience into what it's like for this very driven, successful professional woman to live at this high security prison ultimately for 8 months before you were moved to another prison.
So the first days, first of all, the cell was a small cell, an 8 by 10. The first cell I was in had no windows, had a metal bunk bed, an open toilet next to the bed, a small table stuck to the wall, 2 plastic chairs, and a sink, a small sink. In MCC, there are no mirrors. Everything is plastic. And no knives, even plastic knives. And everything is dirty and cold, and people are angry, and food is horrible.
Were you afraid for your life?
Not, and I was afraid for my life before I got there.
Really? More so than when you were in there?
When I was there, I realized that everybody there was the same. We're all the same. We all had a story.
Mm.
And I felt that we were united by suffering.
Right.
And of course, I was terrified by the yelling, the cursing. Some words English is not my first language. And although I went through a lot of studying and education in law, some English words I've never heard. And they were people talking I could not understand, angry. But ultimately, I realized that nobody had anything with me. Everybody had their own story of suffering. And they were acting out of that particular suffering.
Right. That's a really amazing way to look at it. You tell the story of go ahead.
Yeah. And I realized that, of course, I was terrified, and I was angry of myself and the society and the legal world, and all the negative emotions. But then at some point, I thought to myself, how would those emotions help me?
Right. So I'm curious, you make a big spiritual transformation in those early months in prison. And I didn't feel or see anything in your early story before prison where you had really been a spiritual seeker, that you meditated or thought about energy control, energy movement, breathing techniques, and all the really big concepts you came to embrace about letting go and how to manage yourself within all the crazy energy around you. None of that showed up in your earlier life. Is that right?
Correct. Yes, that's correct.
So this was a brand new way of thinking.
Yes,
And to piece together.
yes, I read the Bible. I read the Psalms. I was praying, but that prayer that I've done all my life, where I was asking God, which is outside of myself, to bring me things that I wanted.
Sure.
And I got there, and I started reading the Bible again, and then one day, within the first week, a girl came to me and gave me a book of Andreea Parc. I actually have it here in my among my books, and that was called Power Through Constructive Thinking. And it was explaining the Bible, and it was explaining how prayer works.
Tell
And
me what it said about how prayer works, because you gave us your idea of prayer prior, asking for what you want, your timeline, your agenda. This is what I want you to do for me, God, and fit into it, right?
right. But then I read a sentence where it said, if you raise your consciousness, you can be in prison and things will get better for your life. And with that book in my hand, Power Through Constructive Thinking. So what is this telling me? It's everything that happened for a reason. I'm reading this book for a reason. What is this sentence trying to tell me? That I can constructively change my thought process to get what I want. How can I constructively? So if I was, what I understood at that point, I was destructive with my thought before, and now I can be constructive. So it's a matter of choice.
Again, I have to say, it's your first week in prison, and you're not in just any prison. I mean, I can't seem to get a handle on just how horrible that place was. But I find it fascinating that you could even entertain those kinds of that kind of big conceptual thinking, that you were even open and willing to hang on to it instead of just being so angry and pissed off at what had happened to you. Even if you were beginning to admit, oh, maybe I did have a part in this. I wasn't guilty, but there were check marks along the way where I might have stepped back from taking all of those clients. I mean, even if you were, beginning to admit those kinds of things, I just find it stunning that so early on in your journey in prison, you began a spiritual transformation, a whole new way of thinking about how you live and work in the world.
Yes, because the first day, the first hours, so it was the trial, who was 2 weeks prior to that, which was terrifying. And the first night, the first day in prison, I thought literally that I would lose my mind, that I couldn't take it anymore. Not I couldn't take it anymore, that I would put an end to my life. God forbid. That was never ever my thought. But it was so painful that it was my only choice to think differently and to read. And to read and then to think and to meditate. It was an escape.
I see.
From the pain, because I've seen other girls who were taking medication and were sleeping all day, and the few hours that were awake, they were crying and pulling their hair out. I didn't want to get there. And reading and meditating and breathing and thinking was bringing me peace.
Did you spend much time looking back and grieving? It doesn't sound to me, as you tell the story, that you did. It's almost as though you closed the door and said, okay, I got to figure this out. I got to figure out a way to survive this and to think through it and find tools. But I have to ask, did you spend time just in absolute grief and sorrow over what had happened and what you had lost and not being with your child?
Of course, I'm human.
Yeah.
Of course I did. But as I said, it was so painful. It was as my heart, not that it was beyond empty. It was beyond painful. Even breathing was painful. And of course I thought a lot to what happened, but not, and I still think of what happened, but not to the point where, and now that I know vibrations, I'm not thinking as, at the beginning, of course, it was shame and guilt. But
Sure.
now I think it more as I didn't know better at that point. I should have probably, but I didn't. I didn't do it to destroy my life and my daughter's life.
Of course. Of course.
But
So
definitely it was painful.
yeah, oh, it breaks my heart to hear you talk about it. And of course, I'm coming off of being immersed in your book this morning. You know, it's this is not even an analogy, but yesterday I was trying to get here from South Florida to Atlanta to film the show, and my flight was delayed, and my flight was delayed, and my flight was delayed, you know, and then finally 3 hours later I get on the plane and I'm like, I really need to get to Atlanta. I can't wait till tomorrow morning. You know, this might, you know, not happen. And so we finally get on the plane and starts lightning and thundering, and we're grounded on the tarmac for 2 hours. And you know, my head was so completely thinking about you in this interview, and I had that sense of, and again, it's not a good analogy, but just complete loss of control. You know, that I couldn't control anything that was happening around me.
Yeah.
I couldn't control getting here. I couldn't control if it all fell apart. And I just started thinking about you sitting in that prison cell and trying to go, I got to learn to think about this differently, because all I can control is myself.
Yeah.
So
nothing that I knew before was there. I didn't have anything. I didn't have my name. I didn't have my power to call. I didn't have my titles. I didn't have anything that I knew. So basically, it was a brand new life overnight.
and not the one you dreamed of.
No. And it was, I couldn't control anything, as you said. And it was a complete surrender.
Yeah. So you said a minute ago, and I didn't catch it. You said something about being present. I want to talk about what you just said about being present and surrender. Those are really both big spiritual principles. Can you take me back to what you just said?
During this time in prison, I came up with my current teaching technique, which is called APPLE and stands for awareness, presence, perspective, letting go, and empowerment.
Yeah, that's
And
amazing.
awareness is what I first was the shock of now what?
And it was also awareness. I think you were very honest, as you have said earlier, that you weren't present when you were doing all of those applications, just one after another after another. You weren't really present. You weren't really aware in those moments, but looking back, you were honest that you were not aware.
Yes, clearly. And I understand now, seeing so many people in this throughout this experience, that there are no bad people. There are only unconscious people.
That's a big statement. Say that again.
There are no bad people. There are only unconscious people. People that are not aware, not present,
Unaware people.
unaware.
Yeah.
And I was there. My
I've been there
life
too.
was unconscious.
Mhm.
And now, by being present to my thought process and I call them TFAs, thoughts, feelings, and actions, by being aware, I keep myself present into my feelings.
And let me just interject right here while you're talking about this program that you've come up with, profound teaching program to help others. You came out of prison and got a designation as a life coach, correct?
Yes.
Yeah. So you turned your life from a place of striving for yourself to a life of service.
Yes.
Yeah. So continue with the acronym explanation.
Yes. So Apple awareness. And when I was in prison at the beginning in MCC, that awareness helped me to make the difference between pain, suffering, and living with ease. And right now, being happy to me means being at peace. Because we cannot always be happy and roses and butterflies. But if I'm at peace, my life is okay. I'm living with ease.
How do you get to peace, Andreea?
With awareness of the thoughts, because we're human and we all have ruminating thoughts. With perspective, how can I see in a different light the reality? Because I'm creating my reality, going back to the book, Power Through Constructive Thinking. How can I constructively think and feel my reality?
Your thoughts are creating your life, correct?
Yes. Thoughts
Okay.
create emotions, and emotions, because we vibrate, if the emotions, because going back and working on myself, I realized how with my thoughts and my emotions before, I created the situation that I landed in. So if I was able to destruct my life, I was able also, by conscious choice, of being constructive with my life. And this was the shift, the spiritual shift that took me from losing my mind to being at peace in prison.
And several really interesting stories as you were in the midst of formulating these thoughts and on this spiritual journey that was also your survival journey. And I have often said about myself, my suffering shaped my spiritual journey. And I think you sat in a similar place. But you tell the story of sleeping in prison. Would you tell that story for us? It's a wonderful one.
Yeah, so when I was an attorney, I had years where I couldn't sleep. And I had the best bed and the best mattress and pillows and all kinds of teas and herbs to help me sleep, and I could not sleep. And for many years, I had a pillow to support my back because I thought that I don't have the support. And that's the reason why I couldn't sleep. So fast forward in prison, in MCC, on that miserable mattress, without a pillow, because there are no pillows in MCC. Only a sheet that is brown, dark brown, and a wool, very heavy wool blanket, which I was calling my Hermes blanket. You know, Hermes has those blankets,
Yes.
the wool. So that was my Hermes blanket. And I came up with this. Now, right now, I call it in my book the pillow mantra exercise, where mentally I divided the imaginary pillow into 4. And I said one it's love, one it's I'm falling asleep, I'm comfortable, I'm loved, I'm at peace. And every time I would toss and turn, mentally I would visualize the quarter of the pillow and I would repeat that mantra. And within few nights, from going crazy, not being able to sleep in prison, to the best sleep I had in years.
That's a pretty incredible story. You know, I've got to jump forward. So after 5 months and that little bit of the transcript I read, your sentencing took place. It was 60 months. You had served 5 of them. After 8 months, you were taken to, you call it the Cupcake Prison, Danbury in Connecticut.
Yes. Yes.
But one of the things that struck me, and so many wonderful stories in there, and I could really understand what your presence and your spiritual transformation did for the women around you, for those 180, 200 women at Danbury, how you began to just kind of circle everyone with this spiritual energy and bring them together. But I want to go back to something that just stuck hard for me. You talked about laying in your bed in Danbury, and you were able to see outside, I believe.
Yes.
And you described, like in beautiful poetic detail, what the trees looked like and all the shades of the grass and what it was like to see a butterfly landing. And And I think you said a statement, I can't quote it, but something similar to nature saved you. You became so imprinted by how gorgeous everything outside was. And of course, at Danbury, you had a lot more freedom, and you had this beautiful oak tree that you meditated under, and people began to watch you meditate, and they were impacted. And then you ultimately taught meditation at Danbury, and then even yoga, right?
Yes. Yes.
But I was just so struck because I'm the same way, and if I can't get outside, I get crazy. And no matter what I'm going through in life, if I can get outside, if I'm under the trees, if I can feel nature, grounded in Mother Nature, I become calmer. I become more able to think. I can kind of get myself into that place where it's a lot happier place. And I was just real curious about the impact of nature on you in prison.
Yes. Even in MCC, um, and I realized throughout this time that prison and life in general is a mental game. And if we know and understand how to play with our mind and how to understand it, we make our life easier.
Yeah.
So even if I was in prison, I took, and I think it was a conscious choice that I've made at the beginning. It's either go crazy or buy time until I'm out to keep my mind straight and sane.
Right. You did a heck of a job with that.
And even in MCC, it was a tree outside of the cell. And I watched every day the leaves of the tree grow just a little bit more and a little bit more. And after all, I had all the time in the world. All I had was time. So why use it to sleep on medication or to fight with some other people over nonsense when I can actually observe life? The
It's a
changes
remarkable story of taking a really rough hand you were dealt. Yeah, maybe you had a part in it. Maybe you were responsible for not being present. But it wasn't with ill intent.
No.
But then being dealt a hand that very few are dealt because they're not present or aware. I mean, come on. You landed in prison and you were supposed to serve 60 months. You served 3 years of that, correct?
Yes.
But what you were able to do with your mind and your transition in there to go from most people would be self-pitying and angry, and like you said, taking medication just to erase the time, and you turned it into this very positive, almost graduate school of spiritual growth. I do think it's really important as we were trying to, as a layperson, and I think our audience, trying to understand what you were charged with. It's so crazy to think that you were sentenced to 60 months for filing asylum papers for people who did bad things, and all you did was file the papers. And then there was a piling on penalty that didn't even make any sense, that you stole someone's or people's identity. And I think it's important to your story as the audience hears this. At the very end of your sentencing, the judge wrote this. Do you mind if I read just a bit of this?
Yes, please.
And this is from your book. At the sentencing, what the judge said toward the end of a very, very long and wordy document was, clearly, the appellant did not steal anyone's identity, nor did she try to pass herself off as some other person seeking a benefit. No government official thought that the appellant was using a client's name to obtain asylum for herself. That's so important. Then he says, what Dimitru did, your last name, was file false asylum applications, the precise conduct which made unlawful by the statute alleged to have been violated. And the judge closed it with something so powerful. And he said, this is the judge said, but was it fair? Was it fair? And you went to prison.
Yes. And it's unfortunate as an attorney, and going through this experience, that the criminal legal system in the U.S. is not always fair.
Yeah, I think that's something for us all to look at and think about. I could go into my own stories of that, but I would just say the legal system did not work very well for me. I didn't go to prison, though.
Well, thank God. Yes.
But I lost a business over it and did not recover amidst fraud, and the legal system did not work in my favor. Andreea, let's jump back to a couple just really amazing, beautiful, huge conceptual things that you've said, and I don't want to run by them, or I don't want to run past them. You were talking about how one of the early things you realized in prison was, first you said, and I think this is beautiful and profound, that there are no bad people. There are no bad people. There are just people who are not working it with consciousness or awareness. And then you said what you realized early in your prison journey was that we are all united by suffering. You know, I created this platform, this podcast, this show for that very reason. I had a survival journey, and I wanted to create a space, just like you and I are doing today, to talk about suffering, to talk about the harshest realities that life throws at us, which you have certainly experienced, some of the harshest. And that, what you said, is exactly what is a core belief of mine, that in the world we are united by our suffering. And certainly in the work that I'm hoping to do here, we are united by suffering.
Yes. And your work and my work now.
Yes.
Everyone goes through tough times in life. And one of the reference books that I've read while in prison was Viktor Frankl's A Man's Journey to Purpose, I believe is called the book.
Journey to Purpose.
He mentions there that we all have our own Auschwitz. Because we create our reality, as I said earlier, and what is for me suffering maybe is not for somebody else, but we all go through periods of suffering in life. And by seeing and meeting so many people and hearing so many stories, I realized that pain is inevitable in life, but suffering might be optional.
Interesting. That's very interesting. I probably shouldn't ask you this question. It's a question about myself. I'm going to turn the interview around. You know, we talk about creating our own suffering. And so I want to ask you, my greatest suffering in my life is the suicide of my husband. How did I create that suffering?
The suffering that you create for yourself is through your thoughts that you might have been able to control his actions.
Sure. Why? What could I have done? How could I have kept him here? Why?
We can't.
Right.
We can't control how other people behave. We can't control what they say, what they think.
Can only control how we react.
Yes. And also, suffering comes from not accepting.
I hear you. I just had to lay it out there for a minute.
Yeah.
I just wanted to step that forward. As you said a few minutes ago, I said, I created this platform because we are united in suffering, and to be vulnerable about mine so that maybe somebody can take something away that will help them in their journey out. And you said, yes, and my work, and we haven't talked about that yet. We've talked about Apple,
Yes.
but tell us about the work that you are doing now out of prison.
So the main work that I do is with myself. And going back to control and to acceptance, a lot of work that I did with myself was to accept what happened and to accept myself, because acceptance has two ways. And I accepted what happened at some point, but very recently I accepted myself for what
That's beautiful.
for my role in what happened.
I would say that's beautifully broken.
And there is forgiveness as well.
Yeah.
Forgiveness, forgive myself and forgive others. Because around this experience where, I can't say that I'm a saint and I didn't do anything wrong, but in this process, there were a lot of people that hurt me and hurt my daughter. I've learned to forgive, because that pain and frustration that I was carrying, and that connection, energetic connection with those people, didn't help me at all.
Right.
So
Right.
that there is forgiveness.
Yeah.
So the work that I
Learn it, it's hard to get there.
it is. It is.
Yeah. So the work you do now with Apple,
Yes, the work that I do now, I help people, especially women that go through tough times in life, not necessarily white collar crimes like I was. But as I said before, we all have our own sufferings in life. And some people can pull themselves up by themselves, and others need help more
Sure.
than others.
I think everybody needs help, honestly.
And I know for sure that nobody does anything alone.
I agree with that. And that works both ways. I think in the early stages of my grief, one of the things that it took me a while to get there, but I read this quote. As a young girl, as a spiritual seeker, I was reading a lot of C.S. Lewis. And then I thought, okay, I read these things, kind of put them on the shelf and hadn't been back to them in years. And I remember sitting in my study one day and I was just drenched in sorrow and in so much fear. And I read this quote by C.S. Lewis, and it's in his book, A Grief Observed. And he talked about he says, how did grief come to look so much like fear? And I went, I'm not alone. If the great thinker C.S. Lewis felt fear as grief. I'm not the only one here. So it works both ways, to
Yes.
find that feeling of I'm not the only one in this suffering.
No.
Um,
And in my work, I've learned that we're both, in the same time, teachers and students.
I agree with that.
I agree with that. I often laughingly say that our best teachers are our partners
Yeah, definitely.
and our mothers. And our mothers.
Mothers, yes,
And I'm,
yes.
I have laughed out loud at myself so many times and said, I do not want to learn all my life lessons from my mother or my husband or my child. Please give me a great spiritual teacher, but not any of them.
The
And
best, yes, the best teachers are those who push our buttons. Yeah.
So a pause in where we are right now. Want to go back again to something very profound you talked about when you were telling the story about sleep and how that in prison you got some of the best sleep of your life and you had sleep issues prior to that. And then you talk about part of your program today as being about peace. And I couldn't help but think you slept because you had peace. You were working on yourself. You were finding a way to adjust to the environment, and you had peace.
Yes.
And you had acceptance.
Right. As weird as it sounds, that you can find peace in prison. It's very interesting that, of course, I have ups and downs. And a few months ago, I was trying so hard to push some things in my business. And at some point, I stopped and I said, what am I trying to control? Why was when I was in prison and I knew I had no control over anything, I was at peace.
Right.
And now when I, fake control, that we all think we have control, I'm not at peace and I'm pushing. What am I pushing? What am I trying to control? And suddenly, the next morning, I woke up in peace.
Yeah. It's, letting go of our personal will, letting go of all the things, as we talked about in prayer earlier, and letting go is one of those huge spiritual principles that I believe we work on for the rest of our lives. But it is just letting go of all the agendas of our life, all the timelines. It's letting go of our personal will. And then when we're guided by spirit. We can hear the whispers of spirit.
Yes.
If we listen.
Yes.
And hopefully then there's peace, right?
Yeah.
So I want to close with something that we haven't touched on at all, and it is such a big part of your book and speaks to your ability to unite people in a very positive way. Your book is scattered with all of these recipes of all the women you were in prison with. And it's a delightful kind of comical and chaotic thing that you were able to pull all these women together. Talk a little bit about talk about any part of that. I'm trying to remember the salmon cakes for Valentine's Day, for instance.
Yes.
How did you get women in prison corralled around cooking?
So women always were creative, and women always had to nurture and come up. I mean, I grew up in Romania back in the communist times when we didn't have much, but I know that my grandmother and my parents always came up with things. And being that, I mean, I'm a product of the Romanian years. back
Sure.
when, and I can understand some things. Um, but it's funny that this book initially started as a cookbook, but then I added the stories of the ladies, and then I added my experience, and this is how it came up to what it is right now. And it's funny that we spoke about I didn't have the funds to publish this book, and my mother offered me her savings for her funeral.
Oh,
Well, hopefully it will be a bestseller and you won't have to worry about replacing those, right?
So talking about helping women, but in MCC, my bunkie at the time, and for whoever doesn't know what a bunkie is the person sharing the bunk bed.
right.
Um, she was Spanish and very, very, very funny lady and spiritual. With her, actually, locked in the cell, she was praying in Spanish. I don't speak Spanish. That night was the first time I felt the presence of God.
Mm.
So she was always in the kitchen in MCC with the Spanish girls, always cooking.
Hmm.
And she was coming to me and she said, "Come on, put the book down," because I was reading all the time because it was the only thing that soothed my soul. Put the book down and go to the kitchen and stay with the girls. So the girls, most of them didn't speak any English. But I was trying the food that they were making out of nothing, literally, because the food that was served in MCC was horrible. But these ladies were buying things from the commissary, very little things, and they were making amazing, tasting things.
Mhm.
And every day, I would go and sit with them and taste what they were doing. And it was a sense of community, like at home in the kitchen. Everybody's
Yeah.
around in the kitchen talking, laughing. And
Yeah.
sometimes, of course, it was painful. And some of them were here from other countries and they didn't have connection with their families. And that's why I said that we are connected by our suffering. But in those moments in the kitchen with the food, we were able to find a common ground of peace and calm. And sometimes were fun moments, and sometimes we were even laughing. Um, and this is how, and I have it in my book, I have several ladies, but one of them, Rita, she was literally my savior. She cooked for me every day.
Oh.
Yeah. And then when I went,
Yeah, it's just delightful. I hope that our readers will go buy your book and it's just to see all these prison recipes. I mean, they're not recipes that you would probably cook like that if you had access to any of the foods you might normally have access to.
yeah,
But it's just fascinating, and I just loved the humor of all of that, and I could feel that sense of community and camaraderie, and I could just see sort of in my mind this picture of all of you in there in your, prison guard in there
yeah,
trying to mash some bananas together and put a little applesauce in there and make some bread. It was
yeah,
just a really light spot in a tough, tough story.
yes. And then when I got to Danbury, they didn't have a microwave. And of course, women had to come up with being genius and find ways of cooking. And the instrument was the clothing iron. They were cooking, they were frying with the iron. And the story that you mentioned, the Valentine's Day salmon patties were done frying them with the iron. And
That is so crazy. That's just crazy,
yeah,
but delightful. I think I'd like to close with one last thing. When I talked to you in our first interview, I was, you know, um, as an artist, being raised as an artist, knowing how much you wanted to be an artist and being pushed to do something that was guaranteed to make more money was heartbreaking to me, because I feel like when an artist's spirit is crushed, it's hard to come back from it. It's really hard to have a full life if that creativity can't live and soar. And so that was really hard for me. And then when I was reading the part about how you found, your writing about nature was so different than any of the other writing in the book. And I thought, oh my gosh, there she goes. That's that creative artistry, that creative streak just coming to life, because the way you intuited, is that a word? Nature, it became gorgeous and poetic in the book. And then I hear that same vein of creativity coming through in the cooking.
yes, yes,
Yeah.
yes, yes.
And I'm just smiling from ear to ear because it, kind of came full circle, is just that creativity within us. I really do believe creativity within us creates our joy. It allows us a happiness that endures suffering, but we can still have the joy and the happiness that comes from our creative spirit. I talk a lot about the failure of my jewelry design business, and I try to always turn it into a place of gratitude. And my gratitude at the end of just a really hard journey with a business I absolutely loved, and that was me creating beauty just, from my insides without any training. I can say, I'm so thankful for the creative spirit within, because I got to use it for 12 years and it was extraordinary. Even if I don't have it now, it's one of the highest highs of my life, because I got to really exercise
Yes,
the creative spirit.
and I think that when we are creative, we can create all the time. It doesn't matter that one thing it's no longer there.
That's
we can
exactly
do
right.
something else.
100%. And I do want to wrap this up with one thing, and it's so much a pillar I believe in and hope my life stands for it, but yours certainly does. And that is, you've taken everything that's happened to you, every single thing, and you've turned it around, and you are living your life in service to the world. Thank you. Andrea, you've been delightful. I've loved every second of your journey. Thank you for sharing with us.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me.
Andrea, thank you. Let's leave it right there for today, and hope we have many more conversations in the future. I want to end today by reminding you that Andreea Parc wrote this amazing book, Alive Again, her story of being a lawyer, going to prison, and coming out the other side. So I hope you'll run out and buy her book, and we'll see you next week. Thank you.